The gospel lesson today is from the Gospel of Matthew. We're in chapter 6, verses 19 through 26. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? This is the reading of the word of our Lord. You may be seated. Well, I think the subject of this very short series, of which we're doing part 2 today, is a little different, maybe, than what you've heard before. And it's something that probably is going to take some time to settle into your spirit. And if you have questions, I want you to come and ask me about them, because I would be glad to discuss them with you. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to get one, okay? So to review last week, what's it take to get to heaven? You remember? You have to believe, right? Yeah, you have to believe. That's what it takes to get to heaven. And then there's this second part, which we're mostly talking about now, and that is, how do you determine what you do in heaven? It's based on what you do in this world. So, that's why I entitled this, It All Matters, because it all matters. What you do in this world matters, and it makes a difference in the next world as well. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis that has always been something that whirls around in the back of my head. C.S. Lewis said that faith and works are like the two blades of a pair of scissors. One is pretty useless without the other. Isn't that something? They're both necessary, faith and works in this world. Have you ever been in a situation where you have worshiped with thousands of people all at the same time? Or in a situation where you've maybe worshiped with 100,000 people all at the same time? It is an incredible experience. The only time that I have had that experience was when we filled a football stadium with men. This was many years ago when the Promise Keepers movement was strong. And we had 50,000 men in that stadium that day, all worshiping together. At one point, we all went down and tried to squeeze onto the football field on our knees to pray together. You ever heard 50,000 people sing all at the same time? It's amazing. And when you have those kind of experiences, you suddenly feel this overwhelming and powerful need, almost a desperation to be closer to Christ. You just want to be closer. You want to be in His presence. You want to feel Him near you. You want to hear His voice. The urge to worship in that situation The urge to be there, to be with him, is just overwhelming. And in that, you also have a desperate need to serve, both to serve and to worship. Now, have you ever thought about the difference between a steward and a servant? Ever thought about that? The difference between a steward and a servant. Now, both of them are actually serving, aren't they? Both of them are serving. Both tend to work for a wage, if you will. But here's the difference. The steward manages the master's assets. That's the job of a steward. It's a specific kind of service that they do. They make the decisions upon how the master's assets are to be used. It's a huge position of responsibility. So, there's 3 common misunderstandings I want to tell you about stewardship. And we are in Luke 19 for a moment. This is verses 11 through 26. And you may remember this, I hope you do, the story of the minas. Now, the story of the minas is an awful lot like the story of the talents, isn't it? They're very, very similar. And the story of the minas is pretty simple. The master goes away. He gives these minas, which is money, gives the minas to his servants, and he tells them, put this money to work. And so the first servant is given 10 minas, and when the master returns, he says, what have you done with my money? And he said that I invested your money, and now I have 10 more minas, a total of 20. And the master is very pleased. He said, good and faithful servant, I will put you in charge of 10 cities. 10 cities. And the second one that he gave minas to said, look, I have 5 more minas than you gave me. And the master is very pleased. He said, I will put you in charge of 5 cities. And the final servant who received minas said, well, I hid it away, and here it is back. The master wasn't very pleased with that outcome. And he not only didn't give more responsibility to that servant, but he took away what he had given to the servant so that the servant had nothing at all. So 3 common misunderstandings about stewardship. The first one is we think that even though God gave us our gifts and talents, He's not bothered if we don't make the most of every opportunity. What happened with the first servant? He made the most of it, right? He took the 10 minas, he made 10 more minas, gave them back to his master. We're supposed to greatly multiply the resources that God gives us. Now, there's so many different ways that we think about that because we are given gifts, right? Spiritual gifts. We are given assets, personal assets. God gives us so many things, and we're supposed to use those things to glorify Him, and to do that, we have to multiply them. I was trying to think of an example of that. One of the examples I came up with is Steve and Doreen here. Now, we all know that they're gifted, right? We know that they're gifted musicians, and actually that is a spiritual gift. So they're gifted musicians. And what have they done? They've worked really hard throughout their lives to multiply their gifts, haven't they? They've both given lessons for years and years, decades, they've given lessons. And that means there's other people who have gained the gifts that they have. They have propagated this gift. And that's what we're supposed to do when we have a gift from God. We're supposed to multiply the resource. The second common misunderstanding is that if God does reward us for serving Him, His reward will be a general commendation that will apply to everyone equally and won't change our future opportunities in His kingdom. The truth is we are rewarded in proportion to what we do. So, what we get in heaven, the rewards that we have in heaven are in proportion to what we've done on earth. And as you recall, the first servant doubled the minas that he had. He got 10 more minas, and he was given how many cities to rule over? 10. But the second one only got 5 more minas, and so how many cities did he rule over? 5. You see, it's in proportion to what we do in this world. And the third misunderstanding about stewardship is we think that if we don't serve God with what He has given us, the worst that could happen would be no reward. What happened to the third servant? Was the worst thing that he didn't get to rule over any cities? No. He was left with nothing. It was all taken from him because he hadn't even tried to multiply the resources of the master. So the truth is we will suffer the loss of any potential reward and anything we have if we don't serve. I'm going to ask you now, are you a 10 mina steward? Have you done all that you can with your life to multiply the gifts that God's given you? I was serving a church early in my ministry, and I wanted to illustrate the story of the talents. And I thought this was a good idea. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But I took 20 $10 bills. I put the $10 bills in individual envelopes, and I laid them, we had an altar rail in that church, I laid them in the altar, along the altar rail. And I invited people to come forward and get the $10, get an envelope, and then I gave them a few weeks to do something with it, okay? Take the $10 and do something. Now, my thought about all this was, that they would buy the ingredients to make cookies and they would sell the cookies, And actually somebody did do something like that. But one person said that they prayed and prayed and prayed about what to do with their $10. And they couldn't come up with a good answer. And finally, they took the envelope and they taped it to a gas pump. And they wrote on the envelope, if you really need this, take it and use it. Well, you would think that'd be the end of the story, wouldn't you? Some wino found it and, spent it on booze and, that was the end of that. Right? I mean, you have no idea. You've lost control over that. Instead, a couple weeks later, somebody showed up in our congregation, and actually was a member of our congregation, and during Joys and Concerns, they stood up and they told a story. Now, they didn't know that this young man had taped $10 in our congregation, had taped $10 to a gas pump. I didn't know that he had taped $10 to the gas pump. She stood up, and the story she told was, I have this dear friend, she said, and I just want to give a praise. Her husband left her with 3 children, and she had no way to get to work. She stopped at the gas station, and there on the pump. Can you imagine? Here's the thing. the most amazing part of all this is not just that he couldn't figure out what to do with this $10, so he tapes it to a gas pump, which I thought, well, that doesn't fit. That isn't what you're supposed to do. The amazing thing is God used the $10 and told us about it. The odds of that seem minuscule to me. But we were all blessed, and we were all challenged in how we see the multiplication of the gifts and resources that God has given us. When you're asked to donate to mission, I read a story about a pastor. A young boy walked up to the pastor and he said, I'd like to get a donation from you for our mission trip. And the pastor thought to himself, I've got this rule, If somebody's going to ask me for a donation, I want them to donate too. All right? So he says to the boy, I'll tell you what I do. He said, if you donate $1, I'll donate $2. And if you donate $5, I'll donate 10. And the boy got all excited. He said, oh, wow, that's awesome. That is so good. He says, oh, wait, I don't have anything to donate, he said. I already gave everything that I have. And the pastor said, you gave everything you have? He said, yeah. You didn't save any money out for snacks or treats or to buy anything? You gave every penny you had? Yeah, I don't have any more to give. The pastor was very moved by that and gave quite a nice donation to the mission that the boy was collecting for. I want to tell you that Jesus has a matching program. Do you know that? Jesus even says that you'll be rewarded tenfold for anything you do. You give $1, Jesus gives 10. That's Matthew 19:29, by the way. All who will give up everything to follow him will be repaid 100-fold, Matthew 19:29 says. So here's what you should do with your treasure. These 3 misconceptions about how we think about treasure. What should you do with your treasure? You should lay it up. You should lay it up. Laying up treasure is God's plan for you. Now, I know it's hard to understand what laying up is, but that's what God asks us to do. And basically it means to give away. Yeah, that's what it means, to give away. Because what we give away in this world is laid up for us in heaven. And then Jesus says, what you should lay it up for yourselves. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? If you're giving it away in this world, how does it benefit you? It's because the laying up is for you in heaven. It's your reward. And that's why Jesus called the man who never laid up treasure for himself a fool. Luke 12:13-21. And where should you lay it up? Jesus says, in heaven. And the truth is that heaven is the only place where your treasure will be safe. I've done a lot of moving in my life. In fact, I got to be an expert at moving, and I don't care if I ever do it again. Yeah. I moved and I moved and I moved. And when I moved, I often had to pack pretty much the entire house by myself. I did it over and over. I packed the entire house to get it ready for moving. And then after you get it all packed one day, a couple of guys in a truck show up, and they take all the things, the boxes that you've packed, and they load it in the truck, and it goes away. Now, you trust that when you get to the new destination, it'll show up again. And every time it has. I'm pretty impressed with that, actually, because every time it all drove away, I thought, oh my, there it goes. So the question is, how do we get it from here to there? How do we get our treasure into heaven? Is it a matter of packing and sending it ahead? Luke 12:33 answers this, says, sell what you have and give alms. Provide yourselves money bags which do not grow old, a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches nor moth destroys. Did you realize that everything you own is on loan? It doesn't really belong to us. Not when we understand who Christ is. It doesn't really belong to us. Luke 16:10-12 says, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? We have an obligation as Christians to be faithful. To be faithful in serving Christ. And we do that with the gifts, the talents, the resources that He has given us. I met a lady one time when I was in the Philippines. I was visiting a friend there who was a Wycliffe translator, and she was translating the Bible into a language called Cagayanan, a language that was spoken only on one island in the Philippines. She spent her whole life doing that work, by the way, and is still in the Philippines today. But I was visiting there in the mid-90s, I would say. And while I was there, I was staying at the mission site, the Wycliffe mission site. And there was a guest house there because they often had people visiting. And the person who ran the guest house was a woman. One day I got to sit with her and she told me her story. Her husband died. And she wondered what she was supposed to do with her life after that. And she prayed about it, and she spent a lot of time trying to discern what God wanted her to do with her life after her husband died. And she heard that still small voice who said, sell everything you have and go do mission work in the Philippines. Now, if you go as a missionary in the Philippines, you have to raise, for Wycliffe, you have to raise all your own money. They don't pay you to do that, okay? You have to have enough money to live on. You have to have enough money to get there. And permanent missionaries, like my friend, they will spend a couple of months in the U.S. each year, and they'll speak at churches and try to raise money so they can do another year of mission work. And this woman sold her house, a house that she had lived in for over 50 years with her husband. She sold everything she owned. And she took the money and she went to the Philippines and served the Wycliffe community by running their guest house in this place. There's a lot of examples about how we might multiply, how we might serve God with the things that He's given us. Her talent was cooking, cleaning, and she did that in a guest house, and she did it with great sacrifice. You put your life in motion by answering these two questions. The first one is, what treasure has God given me? It's a pretty important one, right? We kind of need to do an inventory to determine what God's given us, and how much we give of what He has entrusted us with. And the second one is, what is God asking me to do with my treasure? Something this woman did. She didn't even know what her treasure was, but God knew, and guided her in how to handle that. One investment is not as good as another, and so we need to follow God's bidding when we've determined what the treasure is and what God wants us to do with the treasure. So there's two keys to our eternal experience, and this is that review again. The first one is what you believed determines where you spend eternity, right? And the second one is what you do on earth determines how you spend eternity. So imagine this. Imagine that you have this scale in front of you. Every pastor has had somebody come to them during the course of their ministry and say, am I good enough to get into heaven? You might have said that to someone at some point in your life. Am I good enough to get into heaven? So this pastor had someone come to them and say, am I good enough to get into heaven? And the pastor said, well, let's imagine this line right here. On one end of the line is totally evil. That's 0%, right? And on the other end of the line is totally good, like perfect good, okay? That's 100% on the line. So where do you think you fall on that line? Between absolutely evil and perfectly good, where do you fall? And so the pastor had written this on a piece of paper, and the guy took his pencil and he thought a little bit, and he marked 70%. That's where he marked on the line. And the pastor says to the guy, but what's God's cutoff? Maybe it's 72%. Maybe it's 73% in order to get to heaven. And the guy looked a little longer at the scale, and he moved it up just a little bit there so that it would include. And the pastor says, well, what if it's 80%? Or what if God wants 90% goodness from you in order to get into heaven? What's God's minimum requirement to get into heaven? Ever thought about it that way? The answer is actually very simple. God's minimum requirement. It's 100%. That's it. 100%. Totally good. Perfectly good. Absolutely good. Is there anybody here totally good, perfectly good, absolutely good? I can tell you for a fact, folks, it's not me. No. Not even close. Not even close. We know that our standing in God is not secure. Romans 1:18-19, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And since we all know we fall short, Paul says we have no excuse. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God. God's requirement is 100%. We don't get to heaven unless we're absolutely, perfectly good. Or, you see, God sent his Son pay the price. Not so that we would be righteous, not so that we would be good enough to get to heaven, but so that we would be counted as good enough to get to heaven. Isn't that something? So that we could be counted in spite of all of our failings, in spite of all of our mistakes, in spite of all of it, we can get to heaven. We just have to know Christ. And we have